Well, thank you for joining us. I'm Senator Mark Leno, and I'm joined by a number of good friends. Jeff Coors, who's the Executive Director of Equality California and is the sponsor of our Religious Freedom Bill, which we'll be taking up on the floor potentially at the end of this week on Thursday. And then, of course, our longtime friend and international hero, Bishop Gene Robinson of the Episcopal Church, and Reverend Albert Ogle, who is with Equality California in San Francisco, and then a very special guest who is fighting a major battle on behalf of humanity in Uganda, and that is Bishop Christopher Senyanjo, and has taken the uncommon step of opposing the Ugandan government and putting his own freedom and well-being at great risk in standing up for the LGBT community there who are under attack with this proposed legislation. So very briefly, because I'm sure you'd much rather hear from our guests than from me, we have introduced this bill which we think should clarify for everybody and hopefully underscore that there is no threat in the potentiality of equal marriage rights here in California to any religious institution or to any clergy. The bill clarifies the difference between civil marriage and religious marriage, that the state, of course, has no business in religious marriage, just to make that very clear, and that with regard to civil marriage, that no minister, clergy of any sort, priest or rabbi or any religious institution which does not wish to solemnize marriages of any sort, whether they be interfaith, interracial, same-sex, would be required to do so, and then take a step even further, which states that no churches or synagogues' tax-exempt status would be threatened by their respect for their own religious tenets, which may dictate that they cannot perform any of the marriages that I've mentioned. With that, Jeff, do you want to say a word before we introduce our guests?
I think I would just want to add that, as we look at history and what persecution and discrimination leads to, and what we're seeing in Uganda, that the bishop is doing so much to fight, we know the importance of fighting for equality. After the Federal Marriage Amendment was introduced, and President Bush was supporting it, after Proposition 8 passed, we saw an increase in hate crimes. And the importance of ending government discrimination and also protecting religious freedom are critical if we're going to provide safety and respect and dignity to everyone. And I think the bill that Senator Leno has authored is really designed to do that, to set us on a course where we're respecting everyone in society. We're respecting clergy's right to only marry people according to their faith. That's a principle of American democracy. But we're also ensuring equal protection for everyone, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And that advance, I think, is really important as we move forward in the fight for full equality.
And it should not go unnoted that we are approaching the first recognition of Harvey Milk Day here in California, another bill that we authored with Equality California. And certainly the issues that we're discussing here today were championed by Harvey Milk, who literally gave his life so that we could move forward the whole concept of dignity, respect, and validation for all human life. So, Bishop Gene Robinson, please join us.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here, and delighted to be here as a married man, married to my partner of 22 years, Mark Andrew, but also, obviously, as a member of the religious establishment. It's important, as California considers this Bill 906, to remember that marriage, even the marriage that clergy do when they sign a state marriage license, is a civil marriage. And the division between church and state has become very confused in our culture because we have enlisted clergy to be agents of the state in signing those marriage licenses. And it's very difficult for attendees at a wedding to know where the religious part begins and ends and where the civil part begins and ends. And yet, if you think of what happens when a marriage comes to an end, one does not return to the church or synagogue or mosque, one goes to the courts. It's very clear that the marriage that has become legal is a civil marriage. And so this bill does a very necessary thing, even though it restates the obvious and the already legal, which is this separation of church and state, which has long been a tenet of American culture. It says that the state has an interest in the institution of marriage because of the kind of stability that it brings to the culture and for the raising of children. And that the state has an interest in these kinds of stable relationships for which marriage is a central tenet. The church, the synagogue, the mosque, various other religious institutions will then bless in whatever way seems appropriate to them. This was very key to our passing marriage equality in the state of New Hampshire. And indeed, we did much the same as is being done in this Senate bill to restate the obvious, that no one would be forced to preside at a civil marriage of someone for whom their faith precluded their marriage. And so I think this is a very important step in laying the groundwork for that day, which I do believe will come, for full marriage equality, not just in California, but in the United States. It also, I think, will hopefully put to rest those opponents of marriage equality who thrive on fear and try to scare religious groups into thinking that marriage equality is somehow a threat to the religious establishment, which it clearly is not. The last thing I would say, and save the rest for questions, is this. It seems to me that the church, the religious establishment, has always been very concerned that the state would impinge upon the church. I think this is a case in which the church is trying to force itself onto the state. That is to say, it's the religious establishment here that is not abiding by the separation of church and state. When religions try to intervene in full marriage equality for all of the citizens by enforcing its own particular views on all of those in the state, something that I think needs to be pointed out. I believe in church and state in both directions, and therefore hope that this bill will indeed pass and clarify in people's minds that this bill is, and marriage equality, is no threat whatsoever to religious people. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Robinson. Just to follow up on that last thought of yours, we think that this bill really levels the playing field because we know that there are many clergy who wish to have the law behind them when they solemnize a marriage, and this bill would potentially, when we do have marriage equality in California again in the very near future, and then for those who do not wish to, they should also have the force of law behind them to protect them, so everyone can have it the way that they desire. And unfortunately, it is all too rare that throughout history there have been few individuals who have stood up for the persecuted and put their own lives on the line in doing so. And I'm reminded when I think of Bishop Christopher of the Righteous Gentiles in Europe during World War II, who took in Jews, protected them from certain death by the Nazis, and again putting their own lives at risk in doing so. So it is a very special honor for us to have you in our capital today, and we welcome you.
Thank you.
Microphone is
Should I
yours.
say?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm really very happy to be here today. It is historic. And I'm very much encouraged by Equality California. And I wish we'd have a link with you, Equality, California, because we need to have this kind of thing discussed on the educational level. There is a lot of things going on due to lack of education. And as I see it, this bill, I think, is really necessary. Equality, marriage in equality is very important. Not to have a discrimination against one group or the other, and without forcing people. If you are clergy, you are not forced. You can say, no, according to my denomination, I'm not going to marry these people. But people are free to marry, not to be forced. And to have the same kind of law for all people concerning marriage. This level is really very important. Now, the church, for instance, can also interfere and try to bring in bills according to their belief. This can cause a lot of problem. For instance, now we have what we call a draconian bill, anti-gay bill, very dangerous bill, which actually was initiated by an individual. We call that a private bill. And behind him, there have been some elements, some people we know, some from here, who are trying some kind of their beliefs and the way things should be done, which of course they have been also trying. I think before you had what we call the 8 what? Amendment? There's what we call Proposition 8 before it was passed. And I think people have been trying to influence us concerning anti-gay movement and saying it is a very dangerous thing to the extent that we had to accept having these people hanged, some of these people. So I believe that this bill, if it was passed, which we are talking about, it will not only help you here, but it will help us also in Uganda to know that equality is very important. We don't need discrimination. So I really urge that this bill should be passed.
Thank you, Bishop.
I work mainly in Southern California, where 65% of the yes on votes happened. And it's a very faithful community, and they listen to their religious leaders. And during the Proposition 8 campaign, there was deliberate confusion about the role of church and state in marriage. And clergy are on record for saying that they would be forced to marry gay and lesbian people, that their churches would lose their nonprofit status, which just was not true. And so I really support this bill. I serve on the California Council of Churches Impact Board, representing 2,300 churches throughout the state. We are fully behind this bill. I've never been forced by the state to marry somebody that I didn't think was called by God to be married. And this bill really clears up that role, the role of the religious community and the role of the state. Also, I want to say that the people who are opposing marriage equality in California and in America are also the people that are making Bishop Christopher's life very difficult. The funding that is leading behind this Bahati bill, this horrible bill, is coming from the United States, from movements like the ex-gay movement. And America needs to kind of wake up to our exportation of hatred and fear. So this bill, we're fully behind. We think it will. California will continue to lead. And as the bishop said, it's great to travel with him as he's going around. It will help lead the way throughout the world. Thank you.
We are happy to take any questions.
You said marriage is a civil exercise, but a lot of people honestly see it differently. You've heard the argument that it's against nature, against God. How do you reconcile the fact that some people just don't believe it's in the civil sphere? It's
Well, if you look at the family code today, as it has been for many decades, if probably not over a century, marriage is defined as a civil contract arising out of a relationship. Currently between a man and a woman, we've tried to change that between two people, but it's always been a civil contract. And that's a fact. And I think Bishop Robinson's point that when marriage is dissolved, where do you turn? You don't turn to the church, you turn to the state, because that's where the contract is. And some religious organizations have their own divorce proceedings as well, certainly very prescribed in Jewish tradition. But again, that's quite different from dissolving a civil marriage. So a lot of this is just educating the public so that they are better informed. And I've been amused, if not bemused, by some of the blogs that I've read about the radical religious rights opposition to our bill, saying that we are now further trying to destroy the institution of marriage by confusing people, when in fact it's anything but that.
And how about the fact that a lot of organized churches believe in the hierarchy? There's either church membership decides on policy, or those higher the hierarchy decide on something. And it's sort of against the way they do things to give rights to pastors and those churches when it's against the overall church policy. Does that get into giving powers that the church doesn't need?
I make a point of not speaking for the church, so I'm going to let some of my friends here respond to your question.
Actually, also to your first question, most church people, if not all, would recognize a civil marriage done without benefit of clergy as being a real marriage. And it just points to the fact that what makes you married in the eyes of the state is the signature on the marriage license. So that it just confirms that. This bill, nor this movement, seeks to change the way a church or a religious organization governs itself. So those that are hierarchical, the decisions whether or not to allow clergy to participate in marriage equality will be made probably at those higher levels. Each religious institution has canons or rules by which it operates. This would not affect those in any way. But when marriage equality comes, there will be many, many progressive religious bodies that will welcome it. I think this is something that's often missed in the media coverage, as if the religious right speaks for all religious people, and that's clearly not the case. But even in those cases, it will be the signature on the marriage license that affects the civil marriage. And then what religious institutions do with it in addition will be up to them. For instance, in France, everyone gets married at the mayor's office. And then religious people proceed to their church or synagogue or mosque to have that blessed liturgically in whatever way is appropriate. So it's also interesting to remember that the church didn't even recommend marriage for common people until about the 12th or 13th century. Those people lived together and became married through common law marriage. Marriage was only thought to be for those who had possessions to pass on to heirs. And so marriage became very, very important in establishing that. So let's just remember that the definition of marriage has really changed over time, and even the religious establishment's beliefs about it.
Another analogy to be used is that of divorce. We have civil divorce. But the Catholic Church, for example, does not recognize civil divorce. That's their right not to recognize it, and we can separate out the difference between the church and state in that circumstance. So that's all we're doing here, is clarifying, not unlike civil divorce, civil marriage. Churches can recognize it or not. Any other questions? We appreciate your joining us today. Thank you very much.